Picture a private airfield just outside a glittering coastal city before sunrise. The runway lights are still burning against the dark, and a sleek jet waits on the tarmac with its engines humming low, ready for a long overnight flight across the Atlantic. The crew has already done their checks. Bags are loaded. The passengers are seated. Everything looks set. Then, without warning, the departure is stopped. A message flashes across the pilot's secured manifest in red, ordering an immediate halt. Not a delay, not a request, a full stop. There is no storm overhead, no technical fault, no problem with fuel or route clearance. This order came from far away, from the heart of a country the passengers once believed would protect them no matter where they lived. Only minutes earlier, a directive had been approved by the king's sister, a woman known inside palace circles as the one person least likely to bend when the institution is under threat. Acting under emergency authority, she had suspended the diplomatic status attached to two young children from a once-celebrated branch of the royal family. Overnight, those children were no longer listed in the state registry as protected members of the crown. They had been reclassified as private foreign citizens. It wasn't a paperwork mistake. It was deliberate, exact, and devastating. For years, that family had survived in the gray space between symbolism and law. Their titles still carried weight. Their names still opened doors. Their distance from the palace had allowed them to enjoy freedom while still benefiting from the mystery surrounding their place in the line of succession. But the quiet edits to official records had only been the first signal. This was the real blow. Inside their hilltop estate, panic reportedly spread fast. The parents had built much of their public identity on the belief that no matter what happened between them and the crown, their children's status would remain untouched. That belief was now collapsing in real time. The legal protections they assumed were permanent had been stripped away with one administrative order. And the reason, according to whispers moving through both government offices and private legal chambers, was worse than a family dispute. Investigators had followed a money trail through offshore accounts and shell companies and uncovered a pattern of payments tied to medical arrangements that appeared to bypass royal protocol entirely. The more officials looked, the less the public story seemed to hold. The prince at the center of it all was said to be shattered. He had convinced himself for years that distance would buy safety, that if he could leave the system, criticize it, monetize it, even challenge it, the institution would still stop short of putting his children under the microscope. But the crown, slow as it often seemed, had finally decided it was done waiting. What makes this even stranger is that the crisis didn't begin in court. It didn't start in parliament. And it didn't emerge through a formal inquiry. The first spark came in a room full of wealthy donors, media fixers, and political guests at an intimate fundraiser held at the family's estate early that winter. The atmosphere that evening was polished and expensive. Soft music drifted through the room. Crystal glasses touched gently over low conversation. The Duchess, seated at the center of the table, looked completely at ease. She no longer seemed like someone who had been pushed out of an institution. She looked like someone building one of her own. That was the problem. Comfort has a way of lowering defenses. Confidence can turn into carelessness. And sometime during an off-the-record conversation, she leaned forward and made a remark that should have stayed private but didn't. She compared her son to the boy expected one day to wear the crown. She said her child had more presence, more fire, more instinct for public life. She suggested he was the one naturally made for attention. To someone outside royal culture, it may have sounded like nothing more than a proud mother talking about her son. But the people around that table weren't ordinary dinner guests. They were strategists, funders, image makers, and connected insiders. They understood exactly how a comment like that could be interpreted. And that was where things became interesting. Because in that world, comparison is never just comparison. Not when the future of a monarchy depends on hierarchy, restraint, and silence from those outside the direct path to the throne. A parent praising a child is one thing, but placing that child beside the heir and implying the heir falls short crosses into something else entirely. One guest later described the moment as vanity disguised as innocence. Another called it a test balloon. The comment didn't stay in the room for long. Before the night ended, it had been repeated, reframed, and passed quietly through channels that still led back to the palace. For a long time, the royal household had chosen silence whenever questions came up around the children. They avoided public scrutiny. They dismissed speculation as invasive gossip. During the family separation talks years earlier, a private understanding had reportedly been reached. If the couple stepped back from official duties, the palace would not aggressively probe sensitive questions about lineage, medical procedures, or documentation. It was a cold peace, not trust. A truce based on mutual restraint. That truce ended the moment the Duchess's words were assessed by the king's advisors. Because now, in the palace's view, this was no longer about privacy. It was about positioning. She wasn't just trying to protect her children from attention. She appeared to be building a rival narrative, one in which her son could be cast as more magnetic, more deserving, more compelling than the future sovereign. And once that line had been crossed, the institution responded the only way it knows how. Not with emotion, but with files, laws, and procedure. Old records were reopened. Questions that had once been quietly buried were brought back. Officials who had previously looked away were instructed not to look away anymore. The entire story, once held together by deference and ambiguity, began to loosen. What happened next did not explode into public view all at once. It started quietly, almost invisibly, with the steady work of people who do not care about headlines: accountants, legal clerks, compliance staff, the kind of people who turn over ledgers one line at a time until they find the thing no one expected them to find. By the end of that process, the family's carefully managed story would no longer be protected by distance, glamour, or public sympathy. It would be measured against numbers, dates, transfers, and legal language. And that is where the real collapse began. Part 2. The unraveling of the family's public narrative did not begin with shouting or scandalous leaks. It began with an audit. Late the following year, a financial review tied to state-funded household expenditures expanded into something far more serious. What was supposed to be a routine inspection of renovation allocations and security-related costs started producing anomalies that could not be explained away with vague labels or administrative confusion. The deeper investigators went, the more troubling the pattern became. At first, it was just a handful of entries that didn't sit right, transfers that didn't match the stated purpose of the accounts, payments routed through entities that had no obvious connection to housing, staffing, or routine household services. Then, the trail moved overseas. Following those entries led investigators into the maze of American corporate filings, where layers of limited liability structures and blandly named organizations concealed the true destination of the money. At the center of it all sat a Delaware shell company with a name polished enough to sound charitable and harmless. On paper, it looked like one more philanthropic branch tied to the couple's broader ventures. But the ledger told a different story. The payments attached to that entity were not ordinary donations. They were itemized, specialized, and unnervingly precise. There were agency fees so large they suggested facilitation services rather than administration. There were legal payments that looked less like ordinary counsel and more like contract management. There were medical disbursements sent to a private American facility months before the birth that had been publicly described as taking place under completely different circumstances. One line in particular seemed to stop everyone cold: a live birth disbursement attached to a numbered candidate designation. That phrase sent a wave of alarm through the review team. It was not just the money, it was the language: clinical, transactional, detached. As if the arrival of a child linked to the royal bloodline had been reduced to a managed arrangement inside a contract file. No one in the review office needed to say out loud what that wording seemed to imply. The implication was obvious enough. The dates made it worse. Those transfers aligned almost perfectly with the weeks leading up to birth of the couple's first child. And that created a glaring contradiction. Publicly, the world had been told one version of events: a birth in Britain under traditional medical supervision, with familiar official framing and enough detail to reassure the public while still preserving privacy. But the money suggested a very different chain of events. It pointed toward American clinics, legal intermediaries, and arrangements taking place far from where the official story claimed everything had happened. What happened next raised even more questions. Why would a family with access to the best care available through state channels be sending such enormous sums abroad for highly specialized services at that exact moment? Why were legal contracts involved at all? Why did the paperwork read like a managed operation rather than a straightforward royal birth? And perhaps most dangerous of all, why did some of the funding appear to come from an account linked not to private wealth, but to public renovation money? That detail transformed concern into crisis. Investigators reportedly found that the American payments had not been covered solely by the prince's personal resources or by earnings from the duchess's earlier career. Instead, part of the funding appeared to have been redirected from a budget allocated for restoring and maintaining a royal residence. In other words, money approved for estate property may have been used to support a private medical arrangement overseas. Now, the issue was no longer simply personal or even constitutional. It was financial, public, and politically explosive. The palace found itself staring at two disasters at once. The first was the potential misuse of taxpayer-backed funds. The second was much larger. If the official accounts surrounding the child's birth had been materially misleading, then the legal basis for titles, standing, and succession rights could be challenged from the ground up. At that point, the so-called money trail stopped being rumor. It became evidence. Dethan, not gossip whispered between columnists, but documents, timelines, account labels, and transfer records that demanded a response. The monarchy, for all its pomp and ritual, does not move on panic alone. It moves on precedent. And once the evidence was put in front of the king's legal advisors, they did not focus on family feelings, tabloid fury, or public relations. They went back to the old architecture of the crown itself. Hidden beneath the softer public image of royalty is a framework of charters, statutes, and succession rules that were written precisely to prevent uncertainty from creeping into the bloodline. To most people, titles look like gifts, something granted by affection or denied by spite. But in reality, the deepest parts of royal legitimacy are not governed by mood. They are governed by law, wording, and inheritance rules drafted generations earlier. At the center of those rules was an old principle that had survived into modern times: that succession rights and associated rank depend on being born from a lawful and recognized union, under terms the state can accept without question. Old-fashioned language, yes, but the purpose was unmistakable. It existed to prevent substitution, dispute, manipulation, or uncertainty at the highest level of the family line. Once the audit suggested that third-party arrangements may have been involved, that old legal firewall suddenly mattered again. The king, often underestimated as hesitant and emotional, reportedly proved far more decisive behind closed doors. With support from his sister and the Crown's senior legal counsel, a team was assembled to review whether a formal clarification was needed. Not a public spectacle, not a feud. A legal instrument. The result was an amendment to a century-old succession charter, finalized in midwinter and signed in private. The new language was simple but devastating. It clarified that rights of rank, succession, and state recognition would belong only to those born of a lawful biological union between a royal descendant and their recognized spouse. The phrase had been chosen with surgical care. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. No modern spin strong enough to blur it. And with that, everything changed. The children at the center of the controversy were, in practical terms, pushed outside the protected boundary the monarchy uses to define its own continuity. Their ceremonial styling might still survive in limited form as a matter of custom, but the real substance behind it began to disappear. Funding, patronage, security assumptions, official standing. Most importantly, the diplomatic protections tied to recognized royal status no longer held. The prince, realizing how serious the shift had become, reportedly flew home alone. Those who saw him at the airport said he looked exhausted, not like a man returning for family talks, but like someone racing against a verdict already taking shape. He was said to have hoped for a private exception, some way to persuade the king to treat his children as a special case. But the king did not meet him. Instead, the prince was received by the monarch's sister. Their private meeting, held at a country estate away from cameras, lasted less than an hour. No aides smiling outside the door. No carefully staged photographs. No signs of warmth afterward. By several accounts, he argued that his children were being made to pay for choices made by adults in a different era, under different pressures. He framed it as unfair, punitive, inhuman. Her answer, according to those later briefed, was blunt. Man. The crown, she said, is not a sentimental arrangement that can be adjusted for convenience. It is a state institution. If its laws mean anything, they must apply even when the result is painful. Especially then. He left with nothing. That was the moment, insiders say, when he finally understood that the old rules he had treated as symbolic were still very real. Not as history, as machinery. Cold, quiet machinery that had now turned against him.